How does Hebrew poetry work? Let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Tyler. I'm your resident lo-fi theologian, and today I want to talk a little bit about Hebrew poetry. When we think of poetry in the West, often what comes to mind are names like William Shakespeare, John Donne, or even Emily Dickinson. But the way that they write is very different from what we see in the Old Testament, because when we think poetry, we think rhymes, we think meter, we think acrostics and things of that nature. There's a set form and structure to how Dickinson wrote her poems. Usually they had the same meter to the point that you can take a variety of other songs and basically read her poems to those songs, everything ranging from Amazing Grace to the theme of Pokemon, because it all has the same metrical form. With Hebrew poetry, it's different because you don't have an emphasis on rhyme or meter or syllable count. And because of that, in God's providence, He's given us poetry that can be translated without losing its form. Because the emphasis of Hebrew poetry is not so much on how it's said, but on what's said. That the dominant element is something that scholars like to call parallelism. And what that basically means is that things are said in groups. You say it once, you say it again, or you say it once and you say it differently. You have two different lines that either complement, continue, or contrast each other. It's a bit like reading in stereo. And part of what that does is, we can translate the poetry without it losing its form. Because if you take Shakespeare, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," and you translate it to Spanish, you don't necessarily have the same rhymes available to you. But we don't have that problem with Hebrew poetry. And that is a picture of God's providence as He has made His word more available to more people, is that it can be translated and maintain that form because the parallelism is not bound to a rhyme or a meter. And additionally, when we read the Old Testament, what we see in the patterns that God has written His story through is that He'll give a narrative section, and then there will be a poetry section that kind of fleshes out the theology of what just happened. So often you'll have a few chapters of narrative and descriptions, and then poem. Narrative and descriptions, poem. And that's the pattern through a lot of the Old Testament. In fact, the Genesis account is a combination of poetry and prose. And what we see overall is that as God is unveiling Himself piece by piece to His people, that the doctrine is truly in the poetry. Roughly a third of the Bible is poetry. And through that is a lot of the deep, profound doctrines that God is laying out. That's why they sometimes say that the Psalms is the most theological book of the Bible. And when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament as they're instructing churches, more than any other book, they quote the Psalms. They quote the poetry to expound upon who God is. That the Psalms, the poetry of the Bible, is where we learn who God is. That God has seen fit to make Himself known to us through beautiful words. And this is the same God who said in the beginning, "Let there be light." God has seen fit to draw us to Himself through words.